sworn in for his new role today.
The president is refusing to go quietly on health care after a major rebuke in the Senate. He's suggesting sweeping changes, which could have a big impact on insurance for millions of low-income Americans.
A violent election day in Venezuela. The Maduro regime now celebrating a result global observers say could make him the next dictator. That's not the only trouble overseas this morning. We have reporters on all our top stories from the White House, Caracas, Moscow, and Beijing as we head toward crises and confrontations around the world. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Early Start. I'm Dave Briggs.
Good morning. I'm Allison Cossack sitting in for Christine Romans. It's Monday, July 31st. It's 5 a.m. in the East, and President Trump's new chief of staff front and center at the White House. John Kelly assumes the position after what many view as the worst week of the Trump presidency. Kelly is going to be sworn in at 9:30 this morning. The retired Marine Corps general will be enlisted with trying to restore order to a White House that appears to lack direction and discipline.
That, of course, no easy task for sure. Both sides of the aisle are what you might call cautiously optimistic.
I look forward to working with General Kelly.
I do think that General Kelly will do a good job as the White House Chief of Staff. I think he will bring some order and discipline to the West Wing.
If anybody can bring order and discipline to this White House, it is General Kelly.
I think that in terms of a great leadership component that the White House needs, General Kelly represents it.
A big early challenge for Kelly concerns chain of command issues. Who reports to whom is still unclear. Typically, senior advisors report to the chief of staff. As we know, though, this is not your typical White House.
A senior administration official does tell CNN Kelly has been given full authority. The president tapped General Kelly, who was serving as Homeland Security Secretary, to replace Reince Priebus, who resigned last week.
All right, let's bring in Greg Valliere, political economist and chief strategist for Horizon Investments. He's in our Washington bureau. Good to see you, sir.
Nice to see you guys.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, let's start with General John Kelly, a four-star general, former Marine general. How can he instill some discipline, some order in what's only described as a chaotic White House?
Well, it's got to be chain of command, Dave, and I think that's an area where it's still ambiguous, so we'll see there. To a certain extent, I feel sorry for him. He's got a high bar to clear, since you had all those sound bites from everyone saying he's going to do a pretty good job, or he should be able to do a good job. Number two, he's got a tough boss to work for. But number three, I think the big issue as we get into the fall, which is a budget crisis that's looming, may not be his strong suit.
And you talk about, Greg, what's looming. We have the debt crisis, raising the debt ceiling coming up in the fall. And then what Wall Street is looking for. Wall Street is looking for tax reform. And now there's talk about, forget about skinny health care reform. There's talk of skinny tax reform now.
Yeah, there's talk of that, Allison. And I'd say before we even get to that, we may revisit once again health care. You'd think they'd had a belly full of health care. But we may go back and look at something to bail out insurers, not out of the question that we could get a bill there. And then, as you say, there's a big budget fight coming. You've got to raise the debt ceiling. You have to come up with a budget resolution for the new fiscal year. All this stuff comes first before you even get to taxes. So for the general, who's very good, I would be the first to agree, but the issues are going to be tough ones for him to tackle.
Yeah, and Greg, from what we understand, the markets were hoping that he would pivot to tax reform. It doesn't appear that the president wants that to happen. The tweets over the weekend saying, let's get back to another vote on health care, threatening to pull the rug out from under the exchanges and from the congressional health care plan itself. What is the appetite in the Senate, do you believe, from Mitch McConnell towards sticking with health care and finding another path forward?
Well, I think a lot of Republicans are saying to the Democrats, what ideas do you guys have? And there may be some bipartisan talks as we get into the fall, but time is really short with the budget issue, with tax issues. So I'm not sure how much time they'll have to devote to that. And here we have this morning, Monday morning, a new story. And that, of course, is growing geopolitical concerns, especially when it comes to U.S.-China relations.
And you look at these geopolitical stories that are hitting the news. Well, we don't see the market being rattled by that. You look at how the S&P is doing and the Dow, they're up more than 10% so far this year.
Yeah.
What can really rattle the market? And this is of particular interest to anyone who is invested in the stock market.
Well, first and foremost, Allison, the fundamentals are great. Moderate growth, great labor market, low inflation, steady interest rates, good corporate earnings, so that's fine. There's only two things that I would see that could rattle the markets. Number one would be any sign that tax reform is dead. But I don't think it's dead. I think it's going to plod along. It's going to take a while. The other one, though, the real wild card now is geopolitical. And I think since Donald Trump loves scapegoats, since he can't get North Korea to do what he wants, he's going to make China a scapegoat. So I worry later this week we may hear the announcement of new U.S. trade sanctions against China. For the markets, a U.S.-China trade war is not a good story.
Yeah, you know, if there's any country on earth that's immune to Twitter diplomacy, it's probably China, right, Greg?
Well said.
What can the president do to try and move China on doing something to stop the North Korean nuclear program?
Well, he can threaten, but I think we'll see on health care, you can't threaten Congress. On China, you can't threaten them to do anything. You know, I do think that we're going to have more military exercises, maybe more of these HARM missiles that could shoot down Korean missiles shipped into South Korea. There are a few things we can do, but the idea that China can wave a magic wand and immediately get North Korea to behave, I think that's far-fetched.
You know, back to health care. You know, you talk about what the market doesn't want to see. Does the market want to see President Trump try to implode Obamacare? We heard from Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price on Sunday about this. Let's first listen.
Sure.
What about the individual mandate? Is the president considering directing his agencies not to enforce it? Have you ruled that out?
Well, the individual mandate is one of those things that actually is driving up the cost for the American people in terms of coverage. So what we're trying to do is make it so that Obamacare is no longer harming the patients of this land, no longer driving up costs, no longer making it so they've got coverage but no care. And the individual mandate is one of those things. All things are on the table to try to help patients.
Greg, is the individual mandate driving up costs, or if you take away the individual mandate, this is like a house of cards, obviously the whole thing will just collapse?
Well, a lot of arguments pro and con on whether it's driving up costs. If you take it away, less people will be insured. And one thing that President Trump said a couple of weeks ago that just simply doesn't ring right is that I don't own health insurance. Oh, yes, he does. He owns health care. And whatever party is in power usually views it as an albatross. They don't like to own it because it's such a difficult issue. But I think if Obamacare really does implode this fall, the Republicans get the blame.
All right, Greg Valliere from Horizon Investments will ask you about the future of Jeff Sessions in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks,
You
Greg.
bet. Yep.
All right, insurers have until August 16th to set Obamacare rates for 2018, but the president's threat to cut off subsidies could mean higher premiums. The president tweeting that if a new health care bill isn't approved soon, bailouts for insurance companies could end. Insurers hate uncertainty, and they're swimming in it right now. They rely on $8 billion in cost-sharing subsidies to help pay for low-income Americans. So some carriers, they've already requested large rate hikes next year to offset costs. Nearly half of the companies plan to increase premiums by 20% or more. Meantime, other insurers, they're exiting the exchanges completely. Big names like Aetna, Humana, and Anthem. In fact, 25,000 people in 3 states, they're at risk of having no Obamacare options at all next year, while an additional 2.7 million Americans could have just one option for an insurance carrier. Insurers say they want to work with the administration to fix Obamacare, but Washington's actions so far have fueled instability. Besides threatening cost-sharing subsidies, the White House hasn't committed to enforcing the individual mandate, and that one is really getting younger, healthier people to enroll, offsetting the cost for more expensive customers.
Not clear what the path forward is. Susan Collins said let's go back to committee and try to fix healthcare exchanges, but it's not clear anyone has the appetite for that either. Okay, new trouble from a trio of global adversaries. Russia retaliates for sanctions, another missile launch from North Korea, and Venezuela just in chaos after an election being called an affront to democracy. We're live.
Even if some of us missed it.
Let's be clear. Donald Trump will lose the election.
Join CNN's Fareed Zakaria for Why Trump Won, tonight at 10.
Welcome back. In apparent retaliation for the sanctions bill just passed by Congress, Russian President Vladimir Putin now confirming the staff at U.S. diplomatic missions in Russia will be cut dramatically by more than 700, and that includes diplomats and technical workers. The State Department says the move is regrettable and uncalled for. Officials are assessing the impact and a possible response. Let's bring in CNN's Claire Sebastian. She's live for us in Moscow. So, Claire, how does this impact the U.S. mission in Russia?
Well, it looks like it's going to cut the number of personnel, Alison, by more than half. 755 positions will get cut, according to the Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking on Russian television last night. Now, the Russian rationale behind this is that brings the total number of U.S. diplomatic personnel in Russia down to 455, which Russia says is the exact same number of Russian diplomatic personnel that it has in the U.S. But it should be noted that on the face of this, Russia says this is settling the score for actions that the Obama administration took back in December, seizing 2 Russian diplomatic compounds and expelling 35 diplomats. 755, a significantly bigger number than that. But as you said, it does affect technical staff as well as diplomats, and we expect as well local Russian staff here in Russia as well. But the president saying that the clinching factor for this was, of course, that passage through Congress of that bill authorizing new sanctions. He said this is why he took that action. Take a listen.
We waited a long time for things to perhaps change for the better. We had such hope that the situation would change, but judging by the situation, that will not be soon.
Now, Vice President Mike Pence is in Estonia right now, reassuring that country and NATO of the U.S.'s commitment. That will certainly inflame tensions further. He says he expects Russia's behavior to change. Russia, for its part, says it does not bow to pressure. So this is certainly a tense moment, Alison.
It certainly is. CNN's Claire Sebastian live for us from Moscow. Thanks.
The U.S. and Japan agreeing to take further action against North Korea. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and President Trump speaking by phone Sunday, just days after North Korea's latest missile launch. The two leaders discussing increased economic and diplomatic pressure on the Kim Jong-un regime. But that will require help from China, the target of a nasty Trump tweet storm late last week. CNN's Will Ripley live from Beijing with the latest developments. Good morning to you, Will. Is there a country more immune on earth to a Twitter diplomacy storm?
No, I think China has figured out the strategy to deal with President Trump's tweets, and that is they ignore them, at least publicly. Chinese President Xi Jinping did give a speech just hours after President Trump blasted China on Twitter. He didn't mention the U.S., he didn't mention North Korea, but he did talk about the importance of China to strengthen its own military, and he staged a massive military parade over the weekend showcasing his latest stealth fighter jets and China's own nuclear-capable ICBMs. Vice President Pence also speaking about North Korea over the weekend, saying that the United States insists that North Korea completely disarm, that they abandon their nuclear and missile programs. I can tell you, after visiting North Korea most recently just last month and speaking with officials at length about this, that is a non-starter for the North Koreans. It's not going to happen. They view these missiles as vital to protect themselves against the United States. They also view them as valuable leverage with the international community. And China would argue that, and North Korea as well, that the United States' actions over the weekend certainly wouldn't be an incentive for North Korea to disarm. Just hours after North Korea launched that ICBM that analysts say could strike many portions of the mainland U.S. as far to the east as Chicago and certainly Los Angeles, Seattle, Denver as well. Hours after that, the U.S., with its own show of force, launching missiles into the sea. They flew U.S. bombers along with Japanese and South Korean fighters over the peninsula, and they tested their THAAD missile defense system, which China views as a destabilizing act that threatens their own national security here. So, Dave, you can see China, the U.S. need to work together. They're really far apart right now.
Certainly are. Will Ripley live for us this morning in Beijing. Thank you.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro declaring victory in a controversial election. It's widely regarded as a fraud and a vehicle to rewrite the constitution to consolidate Maduro's power. Government officials in Caracas claiming a voter turnout of over 41%. Maduro's opponents calling that figure fiction. The violence on Sunday, very real. Now, we want to caution you, the video you're about to see is disturbing.
One police officer caught on fire from that explosion. Election day clashes between protesters and police, claiming at least 10 more on Sunday. The death toll since early April, now at 125. The State Department condemning the election, insisting the U.S. will continue to take strong and swift actions against the Maduro regime. Let's get the latest from CNN's Leila Santiago. She's live in Caracas. Good morning, Leila.
Good morning, Dave. Certainly a lot of uncertainty remains. President Maduro may be calling this a victory, but as you mentioned, the opposition is calling this a fraud. You know, that video you actually just showed is not far from where I am standing right now, where for days now I have heard consistent blasts as the opposition and the government forces clash on the streets of Caracas, as the opposition protests what has become a way of life, not just because of the protests and the violence, but because of a collapsing economy, because of food shortages and medical supply shortages. The hospitals are filled with people who may get medical attention from doctors, but those are doctors who don't have the supplies they need to treat the patient. So certainly not just uncertainty, but frustration is what we're seeing on the streets. We expect the opposition to take to the streets as leaders have called for a protest in just a matter of hours at noon local time here. But while the opposition maintains that it will continue to fight, despite admitting that they are tired of the political unrest that we've seen on the streets for months now, the government is calling this a victory, saying it will move forward with the new assembly that was elected last night. And this is a new assembly that could rewrite the Constitution and essentially give President Nicolas Maduro more power in the future.
So the economy continues to collapse. The government heads toward dictatorship. Leila Santiago live for us in Caracas. Thank you. And they say, Alison, the vast majority of the 12% estimate that voted were state workers who had no choice. They threatened to take away their benefits if they didn't vote.
And the question on that ballot wasn't whether or not the Constitution should be changed. It said, all right, who's going to do it? They didn't even have a choice, even once they got up there, whether it should happen or not.
From bad to worse.
Absolutely.
In Venezuela. All right, we're going to talk some sports ahead. The first big league hit for Kyle Farmer, one he won't soon forget. This ridiculous dog.
Will a new chief of staff bring order back to the West Wing? A new era for the Trump administration when John Kelly is sworn in for his new role today.
The president refusing to go quietly on health care after a major rebuke in the Senate. He's suggesting sweeping changes which could have a big impact on insurance for millions of low-income Americans.
Incredible pictures there of violent election day in Venezuela. The Maduro regime now celebrating a result global observers say could make him the next dictator. And that's not the only trouble overseas this morning. We have reporters on all our top stories from the White House, Caracas, Moscow, and Beijing. Welcome back to Early Start. I'm Alison Kosick sitting in for Christine Romans.
I'm Dave Briggs. Not every day you have Vladimir Putin on the cover of the New York tabloids, but that is the case. Real Vlad hombre. But we start in the nation's capital. President Trump's new chief of staff front and center at the White House. John Kelly assumes the position after another chaotic week in the Trump White House. Kelly will be sworn in at 9:30 this morning. The retired Marine Corps general will be enlisted with trying to restore order to a White House that appears to lack direction and discipline.
That's no easy task, and both sides of the aisle are cautiously optimistic.
I look forward to working with General Kelly.
I do think that General Kelly will do a good job as the White House chief of staff. I think he will bring some order and discipline to the West Wing.
If anybody can bring order and discipline to this White House, it is General Kelly.
I think that in terms of a great leadership component that the White House needs, General Kelly represents it.
A big early challenge for Kelly concerns chain of command issues. Who reports to whom? It's still unclear. Typically, senior advisors report to the chief of staff. As we know, this is not your typical White House.
No. A senior administration official does tell CNN Kelly has been given, quote, full authority. The president tapped General Kelly, who was serving as Homeland Security Secretary, to replace Reince Priebus, who resigned last week.
All right, let's bring back Gregory Valliere. He's the political economist and chief strategist for Horizon Investments. Good morning to you again. Thanks for coming back.
Hi, Allison.
Let's first talk about General John Kelly. He's got his new position as chief of staff for the White House. But the White House has had these comings and goings for at least 6 months now. I want to throw you a list here, show you a list of just who has left. And this is just in the first 6 months. So as we look at that list and we think what the tenure could be for the general, who, by the way, is a 4-star general, what do you think, what kind of power do you think he brings to this White House, Greg, knowing how the Trump administration, how Donald Trump runs his White House? Do you think that, that the general is going to be a yes man, or will he be able to go up to the president and say, listen, what you're doing, it's not good?
Well, if the president keeps tweeting, maybe he'll talk to the president. I think that Kelly brings a lot of credibility. He's very highly regarded on Capitol Hill. But there are 2 problems. Number one is you've got 3 different factions in the White House: the New York faction, the Washington establishment faction, and then the populists with Steve Bannon. They don't get along. That's one problem. The other problem, I think, for Kelly is that as we go into the fall, the big issues, maybe more on health care, certainly the budget, maybe we begin debate on tax reform, those 3 huge issues may not be his strongest suit.
But discipline is desperately needed, and hopefully he can instill that. Greg, Allison showed the departures in this first 6 months. The one that we thought was coming was the president firing Jeff Sessions, his attorney general. It's clear that Republicans have pushed back on all fronts, including Lindsey Graham saying there would be holy hell to pay if he fired Sessions. But the new theory is that he'd move him over to the Department of Homeland Security to take John Kelly's place there. Would there be holy hell to pay if he tried that maneuver as a way of firing the special counsel, Robert Mueller?
Yeah, that story day has been leaked, but I'm not buying it. First of all, I'm not sure Sessions would want to do it. Second of all, can you imagine the confirmation hearing? I think that would be pretty embarrassing for the White House. And finally, I think if Sessions were pushed out of the Justice Department amid speculation that the president might like to fire Mueller, boy, that would create a firestorm in both parties.
Maybe General Kelly will put up a big stop sign in front of Donald Trump and say, wait, don't do
Chuck
it.
Grassley may have already done that, saying we will not have time to confirm a new AG this year.
Okay, the president not giving up on health care just yet, even though it's barely on life support. The president had a tweet storm. He's threatening to implode Obamacare, much to the chagrin of those in Congress. I want you to hear what Susan Collins said over the weekend.
It really would be detrimental to some of the most vulnerable citizens if those payments were cut off. They're paid to the insurance companies, but the people that they benefit are people who make between 100% and 250% of the poverty rate. So we're talking about low-income Americans who would be devastated if those payments were cut off.
And she's referring to those subsidies that those certain people receiving Obamacare get. The president trying to basically dismantle Obamacare more than it already is. Is this the right thing to do to get what he wants?
I'm not sure it's the right thing politically, Allison. I think that not only Democrats, but a lot of Republicans would say, look, if some of these insurers are going under, we have to prop them up because the consequence for people is going to be huge. So believe it or not, I do think some form of health reform gets resurrected in the fall. I do think there could be a modest bill that will keep the insurers afloat.
The president also threatened to take away health care for members of Congress. He also threatened on Twitter to, again, change the rules of the Senate. this one. If the Senate Democrats ever got the chance, they would switch to a 51 majority vote in the first minute. They are laughing at Republicans make change. Here's what Senator from Arizona Jeff Flake said about the possibility of changing the Senate rules.
We've just seen the limits of what one party can do, even if you change the rules of the Senate, which we should not do. There are limits to what one party can do.
And to be clear, they didn't get 51 on health care, so forget about 60. But this reminds me of my 9-year-old who, when he doesn't win a game, just says, you know, I'm going to manipulate and change the rules. Is there any appetite for that in Congress?
No, and these threats, you know, threats to take away their health insurance are not going to prevail. But let me just skip real quickly to another threat that I think could affect the markets this week. That's a threat to China. This is a really serious story. Trump sees China as a scapegoat because we can't get North Korea to behave. If he imposes new trade sanctions on China in the next few days, which I'm hearing could happen, that would be unnerving because China has the ability to retaliate.
And we've certainly seen a very hefty run-up in the markets. We will be keeping an eye on the markets if that happens. Greg Valliere, thanks so much.
You bet. Yep.
All right, a new trouble from a trio of global adversaries: Russia, North Korea, and Venezuela. We are live on all three of those stories next. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro declaring victory in a controversial election. It's widely regarded as a fraud and a vehicle to rewrite the Constitution. Government officials in Caracas claiming a voter turnout of over 41%. Maduro's opponents calling that figure not true. Violence marred Election Day, and we want to caution you, the video you're about to see is disturbing.
One police officer caught on fire from that explosion. The U.S. now considering slapping sanctions on its vital oil industry. The State Department condemning the election as well. Let's get the latest from CNN's Leila Santiago. She's live in Caracas. Good morning, Leila. We heard estimates of 40% turnout in that election. Are you hearing any independent analysis of how many people indeed did vote?
At this point, it is a back and forth as the opposition calls this a fraud, as the government calls this a victory. You know, there were more than 19 million voters that were eligible to take part in this election yesterday. And we know that the government is saying more than 8 million voted. The opposition is saying that that less than a third of that actually showed up to vote. But no independent agencies chiming in here to maybe give a better idea of what may have actually been the case. Just a back and forth. Meanwhile, on the streets of Caracas, on the streets of Venezuela as a whole, really a lot of uncertainty as the opposition continues to take to the streets. They plan to come out again. A lot of the opposition leaders last night on social media calling people to take to the streets, to not stand for this new assembly that could rewrite the Constitution and could give President Maduro more power. And, you know, as I was on the streets just in the last week, as that tension was building to that day that the opposition had hoped would never come for that election, you could really see people of all ages out there. I talked to a 12-year-old who was out there as he was putting together a Molotov cocktail to take a stand against the National Guard here in Venezuela. I talked to a medic who showed me pictures that were too graphic to share of the injuries that he has treated as he treats people in these protests. And one of the things he said that stuck with me is, look, these are Venezuelans fighting Venezuelans, brother fighting brother, and all we want is peace. But at this point, all we have is uncertainty.
The economy continuing to collapse, the government headed toward dictatorship. Leila Santiago, live for us in Caracas. Thanks.
Tesla is ready to sell its first mass market electric car, but is it really affordable? CNN Money Stream coming up next. In apparent retaliation for the sanctions bill just passed by Congress, Russian President Vladimir Putin now confirming the staff at U.S. diplomatic missions in Russia will be cut dramatically by more than 700. That includes diplomats and technical workers. The U.S. State Department calling the move regrettable. Let's bring in CNN's Claire Sebastian. She's live for us in Moscow. Good morning.
Good morning, Alison. I want to bring you some new information that we just got from the Kremlin in the last half hour or so, clarifying that the 755 people that the Russian president announced last night would have to be cut from the U.S. diplomatic mission in Russia. That, they say, is up to the U.S. to decide who is affected, and clarifying that it will include